The rooftop pool of the Solstice Grand Hotel shimmered like liquid sapphire under the evening sky. Soft lantern lights danced across its surface, creating warm, dreamy ribbons of gold. The air was filled with the sounds of a perfectly staged, expensive night. Conversations, laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses. Yet standing at the pool's edge, Amara possessed a quiet presence that needed no introduction. Her midnight blue gown flowed around her like a calm tide, her posture effortless, her expression serene. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to try to be seen. The room simply noticed her because it had no other choice. Lost in a rare moment of peaceful stillness, she didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't feel the shift of weight. There was no whisper, no insult, no warning, just a hand, deliberate, controlled, and utterly intentional, pressing into her back. It was the kind of force that comes from a decision made long before the moment it's carried out. Her breath caught in her throat. The world tilted violently. The pool rushed toward her in a dizzying blur of blue and reflected light. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers, but she didn't hear it shatter. The only sound was the violent splash as the water closed over her, swallowing the silk of her dress, her hair, her hard-won composure. For one suspended heartbeat beneath the surface, she didn't fight. She simply understood. Some betrayals don't surprise you, they only confirm what your spirit already knew. Just 3 days earlier, Seattle had been engulfed in a cold, relentless rain. The downpour streaked the dark glass towers and city lights into blurred smudges of grey and gold. Amara stepped out of the elevator onto the 18th floor of Alcott and Pierce Consulting. Her heels tapped lightly on the polished marble floors that reflected everything back in duplicate. Every glance, every hesitation, every silent judgment. The office air held that crisp, expensive quiet where ambition disguised itself as politeness. Amara moved with a composure that was earned, not taught. She didn't walk like she belonged there. She walked like she chose to be there. People greeted her with smiles that were too measured to be warm, their words smooth, while their eyes flickered with calculation. It was a familiar mix of admiration, envy, and silent resistance, all contained in the same glance. This was her territory. Claire Winslow called her into a glass conference room, pointedly not offering her a seat. Of course she didn't. Claire's power wasn't loud. It was curated, manicured, and sharpened like the corners of her cream blazer. She began with sweet compliments about Amara's work, only to follow them with the slow, soft sting of criticism wrapped in professional advice. More collaborative, less assertive. Watch your tone. Don't be intimidating. Don't be too much. These were words Amara had heard her entire life. Always from people who learned early that sunlight is uncomfortable when you're used to living in the shade. She listened. She didn't shrink. She knew the real battle wasn't the conversation itself. The battle was in how the conversation would be remembered, recorded, and repeated later. Later that afternoon, an email arrived. A mandatory rooftop networking gathering. Everyone pretended these events were friendly, but people like Amara knew better. These gatherings were chessboards disguised as cocktail hours. When she arrived, the rooftop was glittering with city lights, and laughter floated on the thin, curated air. Claire greeted her first, her compliment too soft, too polished. The smile that followed wasn't just envy, it was possession, a subtle reminder of the lines Claire believed she was the one to draw. Then Nathan Hale noticed Amara, but in a different way. It wasn't romantic or superficial. He looked at her like he saw her mind, her potential, her unstoppable momentum. And that was far more threatening to some people than any overt display of power. Claire noticed his look. Power doesn't always shift through arguments. Sometimes it shifts through a single glance, the kind that tells you someone sees a person they can't control, which brings us back to the pool. The water crashed around Amara's body, the cold shock stealing the breath from her lungs. her dress tangled around her in ripples of sapphire and silver. But when she finally broke the surface, hair plastered to her face, makeup streaked, breath unsteady, her eyes held no panic, no shame, no sign of collapse, only a terrifying clarity. She didn't look around for help. She didn't plead or recoil in shock. She lifted her gaze directly to Claire. And Claire didn't flinch. She didn't pretend to be concerned. She simply watched. Two women locked in a silent standoff, an agreement signed underwater. This act of betrayal would not break Amara. It would ignite her. Everything that happened next would begin from this exact moment. The moment the world expected her to drown, and instead she decided to rise. The morning light drifted over Seattle like a slow breath rising, spreading a pale silvery glow across office windows and wet pavement. The city was still shaking off the last trace of dawn's quiet calm. Amara walked through those streets with a deliberate but gentle presence, moving with the quiet posture of someone who understood both her worth and her focus, even if the world around her hadn't quite caught up to that understanding yet. The memory of the rooftop confrontation didn't weigh on her shoulders as pain or humiliation. Instead, it settled inside her as a kind of clarity, the kind that comes once illusions have been stripped away and the truth stands uncovered, raw and undeniable. She had seen who Claire really was, and more importantly, she had finally seen who she herself had become. Inside the towering glass building of Alcott and Pierce Consulting, the rhythm of office life played out in its usual, predictable patterns. You could hear the printers humming, keyboards tapping, and polite greetings exchanged with cordial smiles. But if you were paying close enough attention, you could feel an unseen shift weaving itself through the air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A slight change in tone, an adjustment in how eyes lingered, how people waited just a second longer before speaking, how silence in certain conversations stretched just a bit longer than it once had. Something had changed, although no one was speaking of it yet. Amara took her place at her desk, her posture upright and calm, her face composed with a grace that suggested strength without any hint of aggression. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence alone carried a quiet authority, like a lighthouse standing still against the tide, not because it fights the water, but because it simply remains. Claire arrived moments later, dressed immaculately as always. Her hair was sleek, her heels sharp, her perfume subtle but expensive. On the surface, she looked exactly the same as she always had, confident, polished, completely in control. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, something in her had cracked that night on the rooftop. It was like a hairline fracture in the very foundation of her certainty. She carried that fracture with her now, hidden beneath layers of pride and professional polish, hoping no one would notice the slight shift in her breathing, or the hesitation in her steps, or the way her thoughts now tangled instead of slicing clean. The quarterly board review was the moment that would reveal just how deeply the balance of power had shifted. The boardroom was a study in corporate elegance, a long walnut table, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline, and chairs filled by individuals whose positions of influence had long been protected by reputation, money, and legacy. These were people accustomed to being listened to, not questioned. And yet today, someone new would be guiding the conversation. When the board members settled into their seats, Claire assumed, as she always had, that she would be the one to stand at the head of the table and lead the presentation. That was the role she had held for years, the role she had built, the role she believed she had earned through discipline, determination, and a whole lot of calculated charm. But the report placed in front of each board member told a very different story, one written by Amara's hands. The data was so meticulously organized and the insights were so precise that the information seemed less like analysis and more like a revelation. As the discussion began, Amara spoke. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that made every single person in the room listen without needing to be asked. Her sentences flowed with an intentional rhythm, with measured breaks and confident phrasing that carried both intelligence and respect, a tone that neither challenged nor bowed. The board listened, nodding thoughtfully, absorbing not just the content, but the competence, the composure, the unmistakable presence of someone who did not need permission to be exceptional. Claire watched the entire room shift in real time. She watched the subtle lean of attention. She watched a thoughtful stillness settle over everyone. She watched her own control dissolving without a single confrontation, without a single fight. There was no accusation spoken aloud, yet the message rang clearly through every single page of Amara's report. Decisions had been made carelessly, favoritism had been exercised quietly, and patterns of exclusion had been hiding right there in plain sight, veiled beneath procedural language. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sensational, it was factual. And facts, when delivered without fear, have an incredible power. The board did not ask Claire to speak. They did not look to her for a defense. They simply listened to the truth that now stood in the room with them. After the meeting, Claire approached Amara in the hallway. She had a controlled smile on her face that carried more strain than grace. Her voice was quiet and measured, almost too measured, like someone trying to hold something tightly enough that it doesn't break. "Nice work in there," she said, the tone attempting warmth, but failing to mask the tension underneath. "I suppose we'll need to align on messaging going forward." Amara turned to her slowly, not with confrontation, but with the calm steadiness of someone who doesn't need to prove anything anymore. Her expression didn't sharpen, it didn't darken, it didn't even shift in disapproval. It simply reflected resolution, the kind that doesn't crumble under scrutiny. "We will align on the truth," she replied softly, each word delivered with a gentle finality. "And the truth will speak for itself." Claire felt something sink inside her. It wasn't anger, it wasn't panic, but a deep sense of recognition. Recognition that the power she once controlled did not belong to her anymore, and maybe never truly had. In the days that followed, the office began to move differently. Colleagues who once sought Claire's approval now engaged Amara with genuine respect, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it through her clarity, her competence, and her authenticity. Trust doesn't need permission to grow. It simply forms wherever truth is consistent. Claire tried to regain her footing, to strategize, to rebuild her influence in the ways she always had, through quiet alliances, polished conversations, and subtle positioning. But the foundation she once relied upon was already shifting beneath her feet. And influence, once it's lost, cannot be recaptured by force. It must be restored through humility, a language Claire had never learned to speak. Amara, meanwhile, didn't accelerate her steps or change her posture. She didn't celebrate or gloat or seek any acknowledgement. She simply continued being who she was, focused, sincere, principled, and strong in a way that didn't require volume or sharpness to be felt. And that was the moment the story changed direction, not through a dramatic confrontation, not through some epic conflict, but through a quiet reclamation of identity. Because the truth was never about Claire's actions. It was about Amara's emergence into the fullness of her own voice. She wasn't trying to defeat anyone, she was simply refusing to disappear. And when a woman refuses to disappear, the world must rearrange itself accordingly. The days that followed moved with a strange and deliberate quiet, as though the world itself sensed that something delicate and dangerous was being shaped beneath the surface, something unseen but undeniably present. Conversations in the office continued in their usual soft, professional tones. There was a shift, an almost imperceptible tilt in the balance of attention and power, like the first subtle pull of the tide before the waves begin to change direction. Amara walked through it all with the same composed elegance she had always carried, but behind her calm eyes, something sharp and calculating had awakened. It was something Claire had never anticipated, because she had never bothered to consider that her opponent might learn to play the game better than the one who invented it. Claire, though she would never admit it even to herself, had begun to feel the shift as well, though she couldn't quite find its source or shape. It was like a draft in an otherwise sealed room, a breeze that shouldn't exist, a whisper of a door opening somewhere just behind her. She told herself she was imagining things, that someone as inexperienced as Amara couldn't possibly mount anything resembling a strategy or resistance. And yet the unease remained, sitting just under her ribs, tightening whenever she noticed someone look at Amara with something other than pity. People were not supposed to look at Amara that way. On Wednesday morning, Amara entered the boardroom with a stack of neatly printed reports, the same ones she had spent nights organizing piece by piece, quietly, carefully, while David brewed tea and the rain tapped the windows like a quiet metronome of patience. She placed the documents in front of each board member with calm, unhurried grace, her expression open and warm, entirely without accusation. She spoke with measured clarity, discussing project timelines, budget efficiency, and departmental cohesion. Not once did she mention Claire. All she did was shine a light in certain corners, casually, gently, as though she were merely being thorough. Light is a dangerous thing when someone has built their influence in shadows. Claire, seated across the large walnut table, felt heat rise beneath her blouse, though the room was quite cool. Her eyes flicked across the documents, the vendor names, the approval signatures, the dates, and she understood that Amara had found everything. Yet Amara wasn't attacking her. She wasn't calling her out. She was simply ensuring that the truth existed in writing where everyone could see it, without actually naming what that truth was. It was brilliant and horrifying, because it forced Claire to decide how to react. And reaction is where even the most careful strategist exposes herself. "Thank you, Amara," one of the senior board members said with a thoughtful nod, adjusting his glasses as he reread a section about vendor price justification. "This level of transparency is refreshing. We'll review these allocations in more detail over the next week." Claire smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. After the meeting ended, Claire stepped out into the hallway where Amara was gathering her files. The space was quiet. Only the soft hallway lights and the faint echo of distant printers filled the silence between them. Claire's voice was soft, too soft, the kind of soft that was deliberately sharpened. "I see what you're doing," she said, and her words held no friendliness now, no diplomacy, only the bare edge of something brittle. Amara turned. There was no fear in her face, only a calm patience that was more unsettling than anger. "You see truth," she answered gently, "and you assume it's an attack. That says more about you than it does about me." And there it was, the strike. Not a loud one, not dramatic, but precise, like a needle finding the exact vein. Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. Because anything she said would reveal insecurity, guilt, or panic, and she could not afford any of those emotions to exist in the air, not even in a whisper. She simply walked away. Her heels clicked against the polished floor like the ticking of a clock. Time, running. That evening, Claire sat in her home office, surrounded by carefully framed degrees and tastefully arranged art pieces, yet nothing about the room felt stable. She had built her career on control, controlling outcomes, controlling narratives, controlling perceptions, yet the one thing she had neglected to control was the quiet strength of a woman who did not crave attention but respect. She had underestimated Amara's capacity for observation, for learning, for patience, and that miscalculation was now unfolding into consequence. She opened her laptop, typing rapidly, sorting through contracts and communications, searching desperately for any angle she could use to reclaim the advantage. Her frustration mounted as she realized that Amara had not made any direct moves that could be called aggressive or unethical. Everything she had done was professional, measured, and undeniably beneficial to the company. She needed to act. Meanwhile, Amara sat in her living room beneath the warm glow of a floor lamp, her legs curled beneath her on the sofa, while David leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her with quiet attentiveness. The air between them held something steady and grounding, not victory, because nothing was final yet, and not relief, because the path forward still required care. It was something more deliberate, something like shared purpose. Like someone who recognized the beginning of her own ending, Amara replied, and there was no cruelty in her tone, only truth. David crossed the room and sat beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers. Because this isn't just about her. It's about who I am when I face someone who tries to erase me. There was no rush in their breaths, no frantic need to see results, no desperation for closure. She was establishing legitimacy, the kind that, once rooted, could never be taken from her again. Small interactions carried weight, and Claire, who had once walked through the office with effortless ease, now felt eyes at her back everywhere she went. One afternoon, she tried to regain ground the only way she knew how, by attempting to undermine Amara with subtle commentary, quiet suggestions that perhaps Amara was overextending herself, stretching too thin, overwhelmed. But the narrative did not hold this time, because when people looked at Amara now, they did not see fragility, they saw steadiness, they saw competence. They saw someone who did not crumble when pushed into the deep end, someone who rose. And rise, she continued, with grace, with patience, with silence that carried more weight than Claire's loudest ambition. Claire realized something unsettling. She was no longer managing the situation, she was reacting to it. And once a person begins reacting, they have already lost the ability to control direction. One evening, as she sat alone in her car, the engine running but unmoving, rain streaking the windshield in thin, shimmering lines, she allowed herself to say the truth out loud for the first time. She is going to take everything from me. But the most frightening part was that she could not say it with certainty. Because the possibility that Amara did not want to destroy her, but simply wanted to stand beside her without being erased, was even more terrifying. Because it meant Claire herself had created the war, and she was losing it. Meanwhile, Amara understood something deeply. Victory without witness is merely personal, but victory recognized is transformation. So she moved not with arrogance, but with quiet assurance, building networks, strengthening influence, deepening trust. People gravitated toward her because she did not try to dominate them. She listened, she saw, she remembered, and in environments ruled by ego and performance, being truly seen is the most powerful offering a person can give. Whispers shifted in hallways, allegiances drifted. Even those who once flattered Claire now spoke carefully around her, wary, uncertain, sensing the imbalance. The fall was no longer a distant possibility, it was a horizon drawing closer. But Amara knew something else too. A fall does not complete itself simply because someone deserves it. It completes when the final moment is chosen. And the moment had not yet come. She would wait, because timing is not measured in seconds, it is measured in certainty. And Amara was becoming certain, not of Claire's downfall, but of her own rise. The rain came softly that Thursday morning, the kind of misty Seattle drizzle that settled on windows like a fine veil, blurring the city skyline into watercolor shapes. It was as if the world had been slightly softened to make the truth easier to bear. But truths rarely become gentler just because the world grows quiet. As the workday began, the office felt charged with a subtle kind of anticipation, like everyone sensed the air shifting before they could say why. Amara walked through the lobby with her usual calm. Her steps were measured, her breathing steady, her mind already focused on the tasks ahead. Yet, beneath the surface, she felt something stirring, something she couldn't yet name but recognized instinctively in her bones. David had kissed her forehead before she left that morning, lingering longer than usual. His silence was filled with understanding, not worry. He didn't ask what she planned to do, nor did he need to. The language between them wasn't spoken. It was lived, shared looks, shared breaths, shared purpose. They were partners in every sense of the word, bound not by necessity but by alignment, by the equal weight they carried in each other's worlds. Meanwhile, across town, in a corner office wrapped in glass and curated prestige, Claire sat at her desk. She stared at her computer screen, but she hadn't truly read a single word in the last 30 minutes. Her hands hovered above the keyboard without purpose, as if her mind had forgotten how to command them. The feeling she carried wasn't anger. Anger would have given her clarity, something to act against. Instead, what she felt was displacement, the disorienting sensation of realizing that the narrative she had built her identity upon was no longer believed by the world around her. She hadn't been overthrown. She had simply been outgrown. She tried to remind herself of her achievements, her degrees, her promotions, her strategic mind, her network of connections cultivated through calculated charm and relentless effort, but none of it offered the grounding she hoped for. Confidence constructed on comparison is fragile. The moment someone stands beside you who doesn't measure themselves against you, the entire structure shifts. That's what Amara represented now, not competition but independence. A woman who didn't need anyone's permission to take up space. When the email arrived, it announced a full project reassignment review. Claire felt the breath leave her body, not violently, but in a slow, resigned exhale that seemed to last an eternity. The board had requested transparency on acquisition strategy, vendor allocations, and resource distribution for the upcoming fiscal quarter. It was the kind of audit that exposed where influence had been misused, quietly, carefully, with smooth signatures and subtle favoritism, disguised as corporate logic. The meeting was set for the following Monday. No one said Claire's name, but they didn't need to. On the other side of the office, Amara was reviewing case material for a new client, a women-owned logistics firm trying to secure federal certification for expansion. She worked with quiet concentration, her fingertips gliding across the trackpad as she annotated financial details and legal frameworks with precise clarity. She didn't know about the review yet. She wasn't anticipating confrontation. She was simply doing her work, consistently and diligently, letting integrity create its own momentum. But integrity, when consistent, becomes visible. And visibility, once achieved, cannot be undone. At lunchtime, the office cafe buzzed with quiet chatter. A few co-workers approached Amara with genuine conversation, questions about proposals, upcoming pitches, and new recommendations. Their words suggested trust, not just curiosity. People didn't treat her as a threat or an anomaly. They treated her as a leader. Claire watched from a distance. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, her expression neutral, yet her heart beat in a rhythm that felt uneven and foreign. She had always believed leadership came from being the most polished, the most prepared, the most strategically aligned with those in power. But now, she was watching someone lead simply by being principled, respectful, and steady. The realization unsettled her more deeply than she would ever admit. Influence built from fear requires constant enforcement. Influence built from respect sustains itself. The weekend arrived, and Seattle moved under heavy grey skies, the air damp with the scent of cedar and ocean wind. Amara spent Saturday morning reviewing briefings from home while jazz played softly in the background. David was in the kitchen, cooking with relaxed efficiency. Their conversations were easy, flowing from work updates to shared memories to small plans for the week ahead. There was comfort in their routine, a steadiness that grounded the world when everything else felt unpredictable. Meanwhile, Claire sat alone in her living room, surrounded by polished surfaces and perfectly curated decor. Her laptop was open before her, and she scrolled through documents she had reviewed dozens of times. The numbers no longer provided reassurance. They merely confirmed what she already knew. Her decisions hadn't been unethical in a way that would create a scandal, but they had been careless in ways that mattered. Especially now that someone had revealed how they affected others. Accountability, once introduced, cannot be ignored. Monday morning arrived with crisp, cold air and the faint scent of rain still lingering from the night. The boardroom filled slowly. Chairs slid quietly across polished hardwood, laptops opened, pens clicked softly in anticipation. Claire entered with careful poise, wearing confidence like armor, though it weighed heavier than it once had. Amara entered moments later, not seeking attention, not expecting influence, simply ready to contribute responsibly. The review began with procedural language, financial summaries, and projected growth models. Claire answered questions with practiced fluency, her tone articulate, her gestures precise. But when the conversation shifted to vendor selection and resource consolidation, the board's questions grew sharper. They weren't accusatory, but they were expectant. They wanted transparency. They wanted clarity. They wanted truth measured not by performance, but by principle. Then Amara was asked for her interpretation of the restructuring model. She spoke with calm clarity, offering insights grounded in fairness and efficiency. She ensured her words never suggested blame or personal critique. She didn't need to point at Claire. The numbers already had. The room felt suspended in a moment where past behavior finally met present accountability, not violently, not cruelly, but inevitably. Claire exhaled slowly, the breath shaky for the first time in years. In that moment, she understood something with absolute clarity. Her power had never been taken from her. It had simply been revealed for what it was, conditional, fragile, dependent on perception rather than character. And perception had shifted. Amara had not defeated her. Amara had simply stood. When the meeting ended, no consequences were announced, no reprimands were delivered, no dramatic decisions were made. But everyone in the room felt the axis of influence tilt permanently. As the board members filed out, Claire remained seated for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture somehow smaller than it had ever been. Amara stood as well, gathering her notes, ready to continue her day without triumph or expectation. Their eyes met, not with hostility, not with apology, but with acknowledgement. One recognized the end of a story she had been writing for years. The other recognized the beginning of a story she had waited far too long to step fully into. Power did not shift loudly. It shifted quietly in the spaces between words, and the world slowly adjusted around it. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity, the kind that doesn't announce itself with noise or spectacle, but instead settles into the air like a shift in temperature. Subtle at first, yet impossible to ignore once fully realized. The office seemed to breathe differently now, as if the very walls had been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when truth reshaped the atmosphere without needing to speak its name aloud. People walked the hallways with slightly altered posture, their conversations carrying tones of careful observation, curiosity, and something close to cautious hope. Because when power realigns, everyone reconsiders their place within its orbit. Amara continued her work with the same measured grace she had always shown, though she now felt a deeper awareness of how others watched her. They weren't watching with suspicion or envy, but with expectancy, as if they recognized that something about her presence had become a stabilizing force in a workplace that had long operated under the quiet tension of unspoken hierarchies. Her voice during meetings held a different weight, not because she spoke louder or more assertively, but because the clarity of her reasoning had proven itself undeniable. Respect, once earned through consistency, becomes self-sustaining, and that was the shift now unfolding. Claire, meanwhile, found herself navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. Her practiced confidence no longer functioned as a shield. She moved through her days with a kind of controlled restraint, choosing silence in moments where she might once have asserted dominance, observing the room more carefully, noticing dynamics she had previously overlooked. The truth wasn't that she had been defeated. The truth was that she had been revealed, and that revelation forced her to confront the parts of herself she had spent years ignoring. The fear that her success was fragile, the insecurity that admiration could be withdrawn, the lingering suspicion that perhaps she had always known she was building influence on unstable ground. She sat in her office one afternoon, the sky outside washed in muted gold, as the sun slipped behind a curtain of thin clouds, and she realized with a startling clarity that she felt exhausted. Not simply tired from work, but weary in a way that reached into the core of her identity. For so long, she had shaped her professional life around the need to stay ahead, to remain irreplaceable, to hold the highest position in the room no matter the personal cost. But power maintained through vigilance is power that must be constantly defended, and she no longer had the strength to keep defending it. She was tired of the fight, especially now that she was starting to wonder who she was even fighting. Meanwhile, the upcoming acquisition project, the one that had initially ignited the friction between Claire and Amara, was approaching a critical decision point. The board had requested a revised strategy plan, something more inclusive, more community-focused, more reflective of the values the company now claimed to stand for publicly. And naturally, without anyone needing to formally announce it, the responsibility of developing this proposal began to shift toward Amara. The project became the quiet center of the workplace, drawing conversations, side glances, and a growing anticipation. People weren't expecting drama. They sensed that the outcome of this proposal would determine the future identity of the company itself. Would it continue operating under the polished efficiency of Claire's old logic, or would it evolve into something broader, more equitable, more reflective of a world that was changing whether anyone liked it or not? Amara didn't approach the assignment with triumph or an eagerness to prove herself right. She approached it with a profound sense of responsibility, understanding that she wasn't simply representing her own ambitions, but the possibility of a workplace where leadership didn't require erasing others or forcing conformity. She spent her evenings researching community impact models, analyzing case studies, and drafting frameworks at her dining table, while David prepared tea or played soft music to help her stay grounded. They worked in a comfortable silence, the kind shaped by mutual purpose rather than shared obligation. There were nights when Amara would pause, rubbing the tension from her shoulders, the weight of expectation pressing heavier than she let anyone see. But David would simply place a hand on her back, not to guide her, not to offer solutions, but just to remind her that she wasn't carrying any of this alone. Across the city, Claire also worked late, though the silence in her apartment felt heavier, sharper, filled with the echoes of self-interrogation rather than shared purpose. She reviewed her old proposals and past performance reports, trying to understand where her thinking had hardened, where her intentions had bent towards self-preservation instead of true leadership. It wasn't regret she felt at first, but a deep confusion. For the first time in her career, she couldn't rely on competitiveness to motivate her forward. She needed something deeper, something internal, sustainable, humane, and she had never learned how to build that for herself. The turning point arrived on a Wednesday morning. Claire approached Amara in the office for the first time, not as a supervisor, not as a rival, not as someone calculating an advantage, but simply as a colleague seeking clarity. Her voice was steady, but her expression carried a raw honesty instead of its usual armor. She asked if she could review the developing proposal. She wasn't there to correct it or manipulate it, she explained, but to understand it, to learn from it, perhaps even to contribute in a way that didn't diminish either of them. The moment was quiet, almost fragile, suspended in a delicate trust that could have broken with a single defensive gesture. But Amara, recognizing the profound shift, nodded calmly and agreed. There was no triumph in her gesture, no victory in her composure. She understood what it had cost Claire to ask, and she respected the courage it required. They sat together in a conference room later that afternoon, the city skyline stretching across the windows like a muted painting. Slowly, carefully, they discussed strategy points, areas of improvement, potential benefits and risks. Claire listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were measured by thought rather than ego. Amara explained her reasoning not with caution, but with genuine openness, as if offering understanding instead of persuasion. Gradually, the conversation shifted from project details to something quieter and more human. Their experiences, the pressures they faced, the invisible labor of being seen or unseen in professional spaces. In halting words, Claire admitted that she had built her identity on being untouchable, because she believed vulnerability made people replaceable. Amara responded that vulnerability, when chosen rather than imposed, wasn't weakness. It was the very thing that created connection. For the first time, they saw each other not as opposites, but as women who had been shaped by different battles in the same world. The proposal that resulted from their collaboration was stronger than anything either could have created alone. It balanced efficiency with equity, ambition with responsibility, and growth with integrity. When they presented it before the board, the room remained silent for several long seconds after they finished. The silence wasn't from uncertainty, but from the deep, resonant clarity of their shared vision. The approval was unanimous. The company would move forward not with the old model of power, but with a new one shaped by cooperation rather than dominance, by shared purpose rather than personal supremacy. And both women, in their own ways, felt something shift inside them, something repairing, something releasing, something finally being allowed to breathe. The world outside continued as it always does. Traffic, humming elevators, chiming conversations rising and falling. But inside that company, inside that story, inside the lives of two women who had once stood on opposite sides of an invisible divide, something fundamental had changed, not through defeat, not through victory, but through understanding. Their story was no longer about conflict, it had become about evolution. The winter sky over Seattle stretched out, a soft grey that made the sunlight gentle and muted. It felt like the city itself was finally exhaling. The days in the office had become quieter, not because the work had lessened, but because the air no longer buzzed with that invisible strain of rivalry. A steady calm was settling in, the kind of culture shift that doesn't come from memos, but from the people who walk these halls every day. Amara moved through the lobby with a new kind of presence. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't defensiveness. It was grounded. She finally seemed to understand something essential about herself. She no longer wasted energy shrinking to make others comfortable, Nor did she puff herself up to prove a point. She just moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knows their value isn't up for debate. It's not about getting approval or permission. It's simply about who you are and what you bring into the room. Her work had sparked real conversations throughout the company, not just in leadership meetings, but in the smaller, more private spaces where people feel safe enough to be honest. People started talking about their own experiences, those moments of feeling unseen, unheard, or diminished, not by open hostility, but by the slow, quiet erosion of being overlooked. These talks didn't change everything overnight because human systems rarely work that way, but they planted seeds, and seeds once planted in fertile ground have a way of growing, even when no one is watching. Claire noticed the shift too, but for her it felt deeply personal, almost painfully intimate. She found herself reflecting more, pausing before she spoke in meetings, really listening to the emotional tone beneath people's words, instead of just the surface meaning. The transformation wasn't instant or smooth. There were days when her old instincts flared up, a sharp defensive thought, a flash of envy, that old reflex to reassert control. But now, for the first time, she caught herself in those moments. And that act of catching yourself before you react is often the first true sign of inner change. She and Amara didn't become friends in the typical sense. There was no easy label for what they had, but an ease was growing between them, a mutual recognition. It was a shared understanding, built not on a similar past, but on shared growth. Their conversations weren't casually warm, but they held a depth that comes from seeing the complicated truths inside one another. It was a closeness built on honesty, not sameness. Outside the office, Amara and David were reconnecting in a way that felt both gentle and profound. Their evenings were no longer consumed by stress and exhaustion. Instead, they found space to talk about their dreams, not just their responsibilities. They talked about places they wanted to go, things they wanted to build together, the kind of life they hoped to shape. The incident on the rooftop had changed them both. It wasn't just the trauma, it was the recognition of how quickly life can shift and how vital it is to hold on to the people who keep you steady. David watched Amara with a quiet admiration he didn't need to put into words. Sometimes, admiration expressed through just being there means more than any compliment. He admired her strength, of course, but also the softness she had refused to surrender, the empathy she continued to offer even when the world had given her every reason to harden. He admired her ability to stay open, not out of naivety, but as a conscious, resilient choice. But even in times of growth, life isn't a straight line upward. Old wounds can still echo. Small remarks can carry a disproportionate weight. Memories can return, not to wound, but to remind. One afternoon, during a routine project review, a senior executive made a comment. It wasn't overtly hostile, but it carried a familiar undertone, a tone of surprise at her capability, as if her competence was an exception, not the natural result of her skill. The room fell silent for just a moment too long. Amara felt that old, familiar burn beneath her ribs, the sting of being measured by a scale someone else designed. She took a slow, steady breath. She responded not with defensiveness, but with clarity. She explained her reasoning and her research with a calm precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Her intention was unmistakable. The executive nodded, reluctantly at first, but then with what seemed like genuine recognition. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was corrective. It was a shift in the shared understanding of what professionalism could look like when it was unfiltered through bias. Claire watched the exchange closely. On her face there was no jealousy, no resentment, only respect. Afterward, she spoke up in support of Amara's plan, not out of obligation, but because the reasoning was sound and because her own way of thinking was changing. It's small moments like this one, repeated over many days, that can reshape an entire workplace more effectively than any policy document ever could. Weeks passed. The acquisition moved into its final stages. The company's public announcement was met with praise and curiosity, putting them at the forefront of the industry conversation. But for the people inside, the real shift wasn't in the headlines or the financial projections. It was in the way they began to treat one another, with more patience, more humanity, more awareness of the invisible complexities each person carried with them. One evening, long after the building had emptied and the city lights twinkled like distant constellations, Amara was still at her desk reviewing notes. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that invites reflection, not loneliness. Claire approached slowly, holding 2 cups of tea. She placed one beside Amara without a word. They sat there together, the silence gentle and unforced. 2 women who had once stood on opposite sides of an unseen battlefield, now sharing a table under the fading hum of the overhead lights. No apology was spoken. None was necessary. The healing had already happened, not through confession, but through change. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, traffic signals blinking, buses sighing at stops, footsteps echoing on sidewalks. But inside that moment, in their shared silence, there was peace. Not a perfect or permanent peace, but an earned peace, the kind that grows slowly, the kind that lasts. The seasons shifted slowly over Seattle, and spring crept in with the faint scent of rain-soaked blossoms. It was a quiet reminder that renewal often arrives without announcement or celebration. The air felt different now, not just in the weather, but in the office, in relationships, in the very way people regarded one another. It had evolved into something more open, more aware, more human. It wasn't perfect, no transformation ever is, but the progress was undeniable. Amara stood in the boardroom on the final day of the acquisition announcement. Her posture was steady, her presence commanding without demanding attention. The long, polished table reflected the soft overhead lighting, and behind her, the large windows framed the Seattle skyline like a living painting. Her voice carried evenly through the room as she presented the final rollout plan. This time, she spoke not with the tone of someone proving herself, but with the quiet assurance of someone simply doing what she was born to do. There were no interruptions, no doubtful glances, no undercutting questions disguised as concern. People listened, truly listened. David sat in the back, watching her with a quiet pride rooted in deep respect. He knew, better than anyone, how much she had endured, not just in this job, but throughout her life. Watching her now was like witnessing a sunrise that had been building slowly, day by day, until it finally revealed itself across the horizon. His heart swelled not with triumph, but with gratitude. He knew that the greatest victories are often not loud or spotlighted, but deeply personal. Claire was there too, pen in hand, her focus as sharp as ever. But her gaze had softened with something new, something earned. She had learned to see the world from a wider angle, to understand that leadership isn't about competition or validation, but about collaboration and growth. She hadn't become a different person overnight, but she had become a better one, more aware of the echoes her presence created. And that, in its own quiet way, was a transformation as powerful as any grand gesture. When the presentation concluded, the applause was sincere. It was steady and warm, the sound of collective respect that needs no explanation. The CEO shook Amara's hand, not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement of her essential role in shaping the company's future. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt not just seen, but understood. Later that evening, the city lights shimmered across the waterfront. Amara and David walked along the quiet harbor path, the cool breeze a gentle, familiar touch. The sky above was a canvas of deep indigo and soft twilight, and the steady rhythm of waves offered a calm soundtrack to their steps. They didn't need many words. The silence between them was full, not empty. Amara paused by the railing, looking out across the water. "It wasn't just about them," she said softly, her voice thoughtful. "It was about proving something to myself, that I didn't have to carry their expectations, that I could define my own space." David nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "You always had that power," he said, "but now you know it too." The truth of those words settled into her like warmth, dissolving the old doubts that once clung to her like shadows. The following days unfolded with a gentle normalcy. It was the calm that arrives after a storm, not because the world has become simple, but because the people who survived it have grown stronger. The office carried on. Meetings happened, decisions were made, but something fundamental had shifted. An understanding, a respect, a shared recognition of the humanity each person carried. Challenges and disagreements still arose, but now they unfolded in an environment where silence no longer protected prejudice. Awareness had been sparked, and it could not be extinguished. Change, once awakened, rarely sleeps again. Months later, as summer approached, the company held an outdoor celebration. The atmosphere was filled with easy laughter and music floating on the air. People mingled freely, friendships forming across departments that once felt separated by invisible walls. Claire approached Amara with a quiet smile, raising her glass in acknowledgement. It wasn't an apology or a statement, but simple recognition. They touched glasses lightly and stood together in a shared, peaceful silence. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting gold across the city. The world felt open, expansive, full of possibility. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, letting that warmth settle into her bones. She knew this peace wasn't naive but hard-earned, shaped through struggle, resilience, and unwavering self-belief. Yes, there would always be challenges. There would always be people who tried to limit others, to diminish them, to silence them. But Amara had learned something essential. True power isn't just in speaking, but in knowing who you are when the world tries to distort that truth. Strength isn't in never bending, but in rising each time you've been pushed down. And dignity is something no one can take from you when you choose not to surrender it. She breathed deeply, smiled softly, and allowed herself to truly feel proud. The story didn't end with a loud confrontation. It ended with a quiet transformation. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. Your support and engagement truly helped this storytelling community grow, and it means more than I can say. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. I'll see you in the next one.